Over the next 3 weeks, which will take us to the end of this series, I'd love to focus even more deeply on this topic of resilience. So you might have heard last week's episode, which was all about how resilience can look like many things. And there were 3 key areas that I drew out in that episode. And what I'd love to do is focus in on each one of those 3 key areas over these next 3 episodes. And today we're beginning with the Self-Care Bank. Welcome to the Henny Flynn podcast, the space for deepening self-awareness with profound self-compassion. I'm Henny. I write, coach and speak about how exploring our inner world can transform how we experience our outer world, all founded on a bedrock of self-love. Settle in and listen and see where the episode takes you. So I was really interested I was really curious rather, about the interest that this idea of the self-care bank generated after I shared it last week. And it's a concept that first came to me a few years ago for a retreat that I ran, and maybe we need to run that retreat again. It was a one-day retreat, which was all about our self-care bank. How do we top it up? What happens when it starts to run empty? And what are the things that we need to look out for that can drain it without us realizing that's what's going on? And even as I say that, it's a bit like if you look at your bank account and you see that there's a deposit has come out and you didn't even remember spending that money, or worse, that somebody has taken it without your knowing. You know, there are so many ways that this metaphor can work for us. And I'm also very mindful that I spent 20 years working in financial services. So maybe you can take the girl out of financial services, but financial services never quite leaves the girl. I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe we'll forget I said that one. So basically, what I'd really love to explore is one of the key areas that I outlined at the end of the last episode. And next week, I'll also have a special guest with me exploring another one of those areas. And then we'll close the following week. We'll close the whole season the following week before I break for the summer. So the particular extract that I'd love to turn our attention to today went like this. If you notice your reserves are depleted, that you're close to emptying your own self-care bank because you've had no energy left for the things that restore you and keep your account topped up. Remember, even noticing this can be part of how you begin to shift the outlay. Self-awareness with self-compassion is our most powerful asset because it helps us see the truth of our experience, not so it exhausts us further and we collapse under it, but so we can also see the tiny steps we can take to change things in some small way for the better, whatever better might mean for you right now. So what this speaks to is something that, you know, if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, and, you know, other teachers talk about this too, you know, this idea that, you know, we have to have an awareness of what's happening in our lives, in our, you know, the way that we think, and the way that we recognize like how we respond to things happening around us and inside us. We have to have that self-awareness in order to be able to effect any kind of change. You know, we can't change things unless we know it's there. And so having an awareness that our reserves are low is actually such an important part of this whole topic of resilience. You know, my feeling is that so often, you know, what can get labelled as lack of resilience is actually lack of resource. And I remember when I was working in my old sort of corporate world, and I remember resilience became this big buzzword, and I absolutely loathed it. I thought it was just another stick to beat people up with. It felt like it was a way of saying these people who are overloaded, stressed beyond, all reasonable measure, have with like these excessive demands upon their time and their energy and their mental capacity. If they're not achieving, then it's simply that they're not resilient enough. And for me, it just sounds like bullshit, quite honestly. And yeah, I don't often swear on here, do I? I mean, I do swear, and outside of here, but I don't often swear on here. But it really, really makes me cross when I see that word being used just as a way to dismiss the real challenges that people might be facing in their work life or in their sort of home life or family life, whatever it might be. Because most of us, most of the time, are mostly doing the best that we can with the resources that we have available to us. And so if we are depleted in some way, if we are unresourced, if our self-care bank is empty or running close to empty, it's extremely difficult to be resilient. And so for me, I think, so much of this conversation needs to change. It's actually about like, how do we resource people? How do we help people really stand steady in their own space? And this is the theme of the field this season is all about, standing in your own space. And the three themes that we explore as part of this overarching theme of standing in your own space is self-expression, which is so vital for our sort of good like psychological health and emotional health, is being able to express ourselves as we are, in alignment with who we are. And secondly, boundaries, which is the topic that we covered this month. And thirdly, it's the vulnerability boomerang, which is what can happen when we do step into our own space and it feels unusual or a space that we're not so familiar with, how vulnerable that can feel. But in terms of this concept of the self-care bank, if we support ourselves, maybe the people that report to us, if that's your role at work, or the people in our family group, the people in our social group, if we support them in resourcing themselves, in sort of filling up their self-care bank, whether that's through actual practices, so things that are known to be restorative, like movement, exercise, breath work, practices like journaling, meditation, mindfulness, spending time in nature, all of these things, they all help build our bank. But then there are also other things like how we connect or engage with other humans. We know that is so vital, that when people are lonely, their resources can really sort of get affected. Or even if there are people around them but they feel lonely, that's very, very challenging for our human self. So how do we build moments of connection? How do we create opportunities for people to share, to speak, to say what's happening for them? And obviously that's a huge part of the work that I do, is being a place where people can come and talk freely and say whatever is going on for them. And through that, find their own path, almost always find their own path to the thing that's going to most support them. So, all of this stuff, and we can call it coaching, we can call it therapy, we can call it just talking, whatever we want to call it. All of these things, these practices, these ways of being, these ways of connecting, they all help to resource us. And when we're resourced, when our self-care bank has got that, when the balance looks healthy, then we feel more resilient. And I had so many messages from people about this, the episode that's just gone out, the one that talked about resilience looks like many things. And many of those messages were reflecting on this idea of the self-care bank. I think it's something that we can all connect with. And I think even as I'm saying that, I will be creating another day retreat to explore that, because I think we also recognize when we pay attention to ourselves, when we're willing to sit, to pause long enough with ourselves, we all have the capacity to recognize when our resources are low. And we might have learned somewhere along the way of our life that you just keep going, that's what resilience looks like, that you grit your teeth, you gird your loins, you square your shoulders, and you just keep going. There's a truck or a tractor going past on the road. I'm just going to pause for a moment. Well, it's still there, but I've shut the door, so hopefully it's not too distracting. So also I've managed to completely lose my thread, whatever I was saying. But basically, yes, had lots of people connecting about this idea. Oh, that's it. So, we can self-identify when our bank is low. The harder part, I think, is identifying when it's starting to deplete. And that's really where I think, doing this work of self-discovery, self-knowledge, self-awareness, whatever we want to call it, can really support us, because it enables us to notice before things start to get difficult or really difficult for us, that we start to be able to self-regulate. And I'm saying that partly in terms of, regulating our nervous system, but really about regulating like where our energy goes, regulating where we might need a different kind of boundary, not a barrier, but a boundary. And in the field this month, when we were talking about the boundaries, we really sort of sat inside this idea of boundaries as a nuanced and sometimes quite delicate and soft thing. I think often we talk about boundaries as being, very kind of like firm. That's my boundary and I don't cross it. But in real life, boundaries are often quite malleable things. The important thing is that we understand what we're doing with it, and that we don't just go barreling through our own boundaries or through someone else's without knowing what we're up to. So this is all about this self-awareness. And I think it's such a vital part of resilience. I think it's something that often gets forgotten or ignored, because certainly in a kind of workplace, or even in a sort of societal kind of political usage, lack of resilience often gets bandied about. Oh God, what's that dreadful phrase? I can't even remember what it is now. What is it that people say? It'll come to me. When they sort of talk about like young people are, basically have no resilience, but they call it something else. I mean, it's so awful. I've even banished it from my head. I'll try and remember it. But so in this kind of like sort of social, political context, we often levy this idea of lack of resilience at people who are actually under-resourced. So, financially under-resourced, under-resourced in terms of, their housing, under-resourced in terms of their education. And, and actually when we attend to these like really core foundational needs, we see that people perform much better. And I use that word perform with, a huge caveat around it. What does that even mean? But people are able to, to operate in their lives in a way that perhaps feels more in alignment with who they are, who they truly are. So, so sort of seeing that our bank is getting low, or seeing that it's that it needs a little bit of a top up. This is really important. And in the last episode, I also talked about how, one of the wonderful things about being human is that we can borrow from our future selves. There are times in our lives where something happens and we just have to dig deep. We just have to get through whatever it is that's happening. And, we see this in, where people exhibit great courage, or, astonishing sort of feats of kindness and endurance, and, really standing up for others, and they are often borrowing from their future self. They're really leaning into their like deep resilience. But these things, they take a toll. And often what happens is that we are exhausted at the end of it, and we need to rebuild ourselves. And if we're exhausted and needing to rebuild ourselves, it's not because we lack resilience, it's because our resources are low. So, yeah, as you can probably tell, I feel quite strongly about this stuff. I also think that this whole idea of resilience, it feels so resonant right now. I actually, I think I might have mentioned this in the last episode. I'm really interested about doing more sort of corporate work, talks and, executive coaching as well, because I see with the people that I already work with colleagues, with other, sort of friends sharing, that there's so much challenge on sort of leaders' shoulders in workplaces right now. And the one thing that I think we can probably all agree on is that, if we want our leadership teams to be compassionate and empathetic and resourced and able to make good decisions, and not reacting from a place of depletion, but responding to the world from a place of calm and curiosity and kindness and consideration and humanity. And that is something that feels really resonant with this whole conversation around resilience. And, I think there's something I sort of mentioned about boundaries. There's something else here about boundaries, I think, are part of what enables us to maintain our resilience. Being clear about where our boundaries are, where we end and another person begins, that's part of how this work of resilience can really support us. And it certainly is part of what helps us protect what our reserves that are in our self-care bank too. And also, there's a line that I shared again in the field this month, which was, learning to pause is itself a boundary. And so, when we think about pausing, and the extension of that, which is of course rest, as being such an important tool for what enables us to be able to show up in the world and to be strong and resilient. I think there's so much, so many of the what's the word, the kind of the learnings that we can have if we've grown up in a corporate environment. So many of those learnings can point away from rest or pausing being valuable things. Often, certainly in some of the environments where I worked, decisiveness was valued much more highly than reflection. Or I remember sort of one person in my team once telling me that he had been told, never tell somebody that you don't know the answer, which is just nonsense. That to me sounds like something that's immediately going to deplete you, because it's you're not showing up authentically. If you're pretending that you know something, even if you know that what you're saying is nonsense, that's not in alignment with yourself, and therefore that's another little thing that will potentially deplete your self-care bank and your ultimately your resilience, your resourcefulness. So that was a bit of a blah blah blah. Let's see what came out of my mouth. I think also, just one other point on this is, I mentioned before that I really struggle often with the way that the phrase resilience is used. And yet, one of the chapters in The Heart of Change, which is the book that we work through on the year-long Immerse program, one of those chapters is called Compassionate Resilience. And that's really what we're talking about here. Because when we understand ourselves with self-compassion, when we have self-awareness with self-compassion, or, that phrase that I often use, compassionate self-inquiry, then that actually is what leads us to resilience. So we can think of resilience as being a compassionate thing in that context. So I just wanted to name that as well. All right, my darlings. And yeah, was there anything else that I wanted to share? I don't think so, but next week I've got a special guest. I've got Adam coming back, Adam Lind, who's the author of Floating Home, and he's been on the show before, and we're going to talk about how masking can present itself as a form of resilience. And I'm really interested to unpack that with Adam, so it might be a slightly longer episode, and I'm sure it'll go off in lots of lovely, delicious directions. So I look forward to that. And in the meantime, I wish you so much love, and a hug, and a wave.